So he came to a Samaritan city called Sychar, near the plot of ground that Jacob had given to his son Joseph. Jacob's well was there. And Jesus, tired out by his journey, It's not in my sermon, but there are just so many beautiful things in this story. This is John's gospel. This is the Word made flesh. This is the gospel that begins at creation and sees Jesus as the Logos, the eternal principle of creation. And yet John is also the gospel where it says Jesus was tired. And in John chapter 11, it will say Jesus wept. And finally in John, when Jesus is dangling on the cross, it will record his words, I'm thirsty. It's so fascinating that John can picture Jesus as with God before creation, and then also picture Jesus so human, so vulnerable. But I don't want to talk about that. Jesus, tired out by his journey, was sitting by the well. It was about noon. A Samaritan woman came to draw water, and Jesus said to her, "Give me a drink." Jacob's well is outside a town called Sychar, and Jacob's well is also near a town, a more famous town. That more famous town has had many different names over the centuries. Back in Jacob's day, that town was called Shechem. Shechem. You ever see that in the Bible? Shechem. By the time of Jesus, it was no longer called Shechem. It was called Neapolis. Neapolis. The 9 towns, because there's 9 little villages there in that region. Now, the name of that town is called Nablus. Nablus. Nablus today is known as the world capital of terrorism. Nablus is where the Second Intifada began. Nablus has a nickname, Fire Mountain, because there has been so much violence over the centuries in Nablus. Napoleon's troops turned back at Nablus in the early 1800s. To understand the story of Jesus and the woman at the well, you must know it takes place in a bad neighborhood. You do not want a flat tire at Jacob's well, or an empty stomach, or a bucket with a hole in it. It is a bad day at Black Rock when you get stranded at Sychar. It's the last place on earth you want to be with the needle on E. There's a town like Sychar near where I grew up. It is called Raywick, Kentucky. When you drive through Raywick, you keep your eyes straight ahead. What are you looking at? Raywick was home to bootleggers during Prohibition, and now it is home to marijuana growers. Back in the 1930s, John Dillinger hid out in Raywick because there was a train from Chicago to Florida that passed through Marion County, and he got off and stayed in Raywick because he knew the law dared not go to Raywick. Have you ever been in a bad neighborhood? And in Raywick, in Black Rock, and in Sychar, the last place you want to be stranded, Jesus found himself all alone. Not with Peter, James, and John. You know, there's so many stories where he sends the disciples off, but he keeps Peter, James, and John. This time, he sends them all off. I think he was worried about them. You guys need to stick together. I need all 12 of you together. I'll be fine here at the well because it's noon, and trust me, nobody draws water at noon. Why would you want to carry that bucket of water in the hottest part of the day? This story begins like it's going to be a bad story with a bad guy in it, where you are the stranger in town and the town turns dangerous. But then it becomes a different kind of story because Jesus met a woman at the well. There are two songs I can't get out of my head as I read this passage for today. Muriel, do you know them? There's a song called Jesus Met a Woman at the Well. Jesus met a woman at the well. Jesus met a woman at the well, oh Lord. And he told her everything she'd ever done. You ever heard that? No? Mahalia Jackson sang it. Where you been? Jesus met a woman at the well. Jesus met a woman at the well. Jesus met a woman at the well, oh Lord. And he told her everything she'd ever done. That's one song. There's another song about this story from the African American songbook, from the spirituals. And it's, Jesus gave me water. Jesus gave me water. Jesus gave me water. I want to let his praises swell. Jesus gave me water. He gave me living water. Jesus gave me water, and it was not from the well. All right, I'm not making those things up. Will you trust me? Jesus gave me water. I've got a version of that at home by Sam Cooke. Jesus gave me water, and it was not from the well. Why did African Americans, during those centuries of slavery, when they were making songs out of Bible stories, why were they attracted to this story? Why did they sing, Jesus met a woman at the well? Why did they sing, Jesus gave me water, and it was not from the well? Maybe because they spent their whole lives passing through Samaria. Maybe they spent their whole lives in a bad neighborhood. They could not escape, and they spent their whole lives asking, please, sir, give me a drink of water. Living water. And can you understand why they said, I want water from the well? No, water that's not from the well. I said it just the opposite. If I ever say the wrong thing, will you read my mind and understand what I meant? Good. Living water, not from the well, not from the old master, not from the old miss, not from any of the principalities and powers. Water that the world can't give you and the world can't take away. Living, lasting, loving water that is not from the well. I don't want to spend my whole life passing through Samaria. I don't want to be in a bad neighborhood any more than I have to be. But at the same time, I never want to lose my thirst. I never want to forget that I am thirsty for the living water. I will not be sated with the swill. Do you have a thirst for living water, for deeper water, for buckets full, splashing over of living, lasting, loving water, not the Kool-Aid? Don't settle. We keep coming back to this. Remember the sermon a few weeks ago on hungering for righteousness. Oh, the junk food we eat, physically and spiritually. You need that living water. But here's what I'm going to preach on this morning, because there's too many things in this sermon. I'll say one other thing. The first time I was a pastor, I was in my 20s, and I preached on this sermon. Jesus met a woman at the well, and they tell you in seminary you're supposed to have 3 points and a poem. I had 9 points. And the sermon went on and on and on. But even I thought, well, this will be a good sign that I've matured as a pastor, because I'll be able to narrow it down and focus. But this passage is so full that it's hard to. I could have 9 points. And in fact, in a minute, I'm going to ask Kyle and Darren to share with us what they hear in this passage, because there's no way I can exhaust all its meaning. But here's what I think I'm going to talk about. We'll see what actually happens. That Jesus ignores the lines. I want to see what Farrah's up to, because she's the assistant pastor today. You understand, there was a line between Jews and Samaritans. They weren't supposed to talk to each other. They weren't supposed to deal with each other. When they encountered each other, they were programmed not to like each other. They'd been taught all their lives, you're better than them. We have the answer, they don't. There was a line between men and women in Jesus' day. Well, Farrah, think about this. How would it feel to you if you were in school? You can sit down. Let me finish. All right. Let's say you're in school and they had different rules for the girls and different rules for the boys. And the boys could go out to recess and the girls had to stay in. And the boys could answer questions from the teacher and the girls couldn't. How would that make you feel? It would not be very fair, but do you understand that's the way the world was for a long time, and still is some places? There are different rules for boys and girls. Can you imagine? There was a line in Jesus' day, and it said, oh, you can't speak to a woman in public if you're a man because she belongs to somebody else. Women can't have casual conversations because women are just someone's object, someone's property, someone's babe. I mean, it's like you're walking down the hall and the high school football team captain pushes you and says, hey, were you talking to my girl? You can't talk to her. That's how life was. There was a line. There was a line there between good people and bad people. Between people who seemed righteous and women who had 5 husbands, women who had a reputation. There was a line you didn't cross. If you knew someone who you thought was bad, what did you do? You ignored them because bad was contagious. Jesus never saw these lines. Jesus never saw these lines. When Jesus saw people, he saw their hearts. There's a saying, man plans, God laughs. I think of it as man grafts, God laughs. Men, we put lines all over everything. There's a line between us and them. There's a line between men and women. There's a line between the Needham Rockets and the Newton Tigers. Right now we've got, listen, the world is in a very dangerous place right now because of some of these lines. That line that says Ukraine or Russia or Crimea. Can you imagine the trouble we get into because of the lines? Try to teach the birds about lines. I think all the birds flying from Mexico have to stop at El Paso. It's like trying to teach dogs about property lines. It's like trying to teach children not to make shortcuts through people's backyards. And who's right? Who has the right perspective on lines? The birds or the real estate lawyers? The birds. And the children understand the shortcuts. What lines do we see? It's okay, baby. You are totally okay. Another thing about this business with the lines in the Ukraine and Russia right now is it leads people like me who kind of grew up programmed to dislike Russians. That was kind of part of my deep training as a child, to imagine there was a line between Americans and Russians, and all of a sudden I'd forgotten it, but now I've got out the old map, the map from the Cold War, and all of a sudden I'm looking at it again and I see a line. Oh, the lines. We have to see the world like Jesus did without the lines. There are lines in this congregation. We do pretty well on some of the lines. We're not snobs. That's one thing you can say about this church. We are not snobs. We don't see lines between gays and straight in this church. We're too scrappy to put on airs in this congregation. But you know, we have lines between personality types and work styles. Some of us are from entirely different planets. And of course, we still have that same challenge. What do you do when you've got Lennons and McCartneys and Mutts and Jeffs and Bettys and Veronicas? Will you let those differences pull you apart, or will you value the difference and see how the different voices harmonize to make us stronger? There is a deep mystical vision that only a few saints have had, and I don't have it, but I've imagined it, and maybe you have too, to see the world with Christ's eyes, without the lines. To see that really we are all just single cells of one body. We're not actually even apart. We're one. All reality is one. I can hear the Apostle Paul in 1 Corinthians 11, right before the love chapter. He says, I hear there are divisions among you. Can you imagine that? Divisions? In a congregation? In a family? In a town? In a world? There's Paul. I hear there's some divisions among you. What's he going to say? He says, can the hand say to the eyes, I don't need you? Of course there's difference. That's why I made you the way you are. But the hands can't say to the eye, I don't need you. in our world, in our congregation, in our families and homes, can we see the world as Jesus did when he met a woman at the well, a world without lines? And at this point, I'm going to step back and ask Minister Kyle, and I don't know if we can call you Minister Darren yet, but we'll just call you Darren, if they see anything in this passage that interests them.
Well, I will preface this with saying that this passage is the passage that was preached on for a week when I went out to Colorado for the encounter program that I heard God's call at. So this is a scripture that is very meaningful to me as well. I think that for me personally, the most important part is the testimony given by the Samaritan woman to her town. That she owned that Jesus knew everything that she had ever done, good and bad. And that because of this, because of her experience, her encounter with the Lord, she knew him. She knew that he was a prophet, that he might be the Messiah. And this is something that we are to take for ourselves. We can be told that what we think is wrong, that what we contemplate could be an error, but no one can tell us that our experience is incorrect. The way that we meet and encounter Jesus in our lives is the one thing that people cannot say is wrong. So like the Samaritan woman at the well, we are to express, we are to show how Jesus has moved in our lives, how he has known everything we have done, and how that has changed us into better people for it.
So as Greg was talking this morning, I heard the situation of the Samaritan woman a little differently. I think oftentimes we hear that she's had 5 husbands and, you know, that the person she's with right now is not her husband, and we think that, I just think that over time it's been thought of as her choice. Like she had some say about all of that. You know, sometimes she's called a prostitute in some, you know, commentaries. But I think, you know, it very well could be. Women didn't have a lot of agency back in the day. And if this is a terrible neighborhood where there's a lot of bloodshed, people are dying all the time, you know, it could very well be that she has had 5 husbands because none of them are living anymore, you know, because they have passed on for one reason or another. And it just, you know, this whole, as I was reflecting on the passage, I kept imagining this cracked, dry desert earth. You know, when it gets really dry and you just see brittle crumbs of earth, you know, flaking all over the ground and these deep gouged cracks everywhere. And that's kind of how, like, I think about this woman. She's just broken into pieces. Her life has been broken into pieces. And then, you know, you think about water and what it does when it washes over that dry, cracked ground. Sometimes even causing a flood because the earth can't absorb it fast enough. And so I think about the encounter of the woman and Christ and what that meant for her. That somebody would be, you know, she comes to that well all the time. This is where she goes. She gets water, and, you know, whether it's for herself, but my impression is that it probably goes to a lot of other people. So she comes to that well and gets water for other people all the time. And here is somebody who is not only offering her something, like offering her some water of a different nature, but is saying that God sees us as equals. So it doesn't matter where you're from or where I'm from or what you believe or what I believe, that eventually, and the day is now, we will all worship in the same way. You, this woman who is broken, and me, the Messiah, worshiping God in the same way. And so to be valued in that way, I think just filled this woman to overflowing. So that's what I heard this morning.
Well, now I'm going to wrap this baby up. I think that's so interesting. I appreciate, and I'm going to now come back to it, what Kyle said about he heard so emphatically, he told me everything I'd ever done. And yet, he still loved me. And then I loved your image of the parched, broken ground and how the living water brings it back together. To see with Jesus' eyes the world without lines, you gotta look deep at those lines. We talked about the lines in the world. We talked about lines in the congregation. I mentioned, but I didn't talk about lines in your homes, lines in your families. But I want you to look even deeper. I want you to look at lines inside your soul. Because there are parts of you that may be in shadow and parts of you that may be in light. And there may be rooms inside the privacy of your heart's home, rooms that you keep locked. You may have closets. You may have cellars inside you. You may have parts of you that are divided off. You may have places in your heart you try not to visit or ever remember or talk about. How could we finally see ourselves without these lines? And how could we bring peace to the coldest war of all? The Cold War we carry on inside us. Are there bad neighborhoods in your heart? Oh, if we could only see ourselves with the eyes of Jesus. Bernard of Clairvaux called this the highest love, the love of self for the sake of God. Could you see yourselves with the compassion Jesus sees you with? Because there is someone who could tell you everything you've ever done. And what would that person say to you? I love you. I know it all, and I love you. At the end of this story, this beautiful small detail, it says that the Samaritans invited Jesus into their town. Can you imagine? You're driving through Raywick and you're worried something bad is going to happen. There are bad people there. My brother-in-law Joel tells a story about he was there one time and they were all eating squirrel stew. I'll tell you the rest of the story later about that little kid walking around gnawing on a... Anyway. Raywick, the bad neighborhood. But how does the story end? It says they invited Jesus. He stayed there for 2 days. Turned out to be the greatest, nicest people you'd ever meet. They asked him to stay with them, and he stayed there 2 days. I know a place that you might think is a bad neighborhood. It's dangerous. And you know where it is? It's deep inside you. Behold, he stands at the door and knocks. Will you open up and let Jesus into the house of your heart? Because Jesus sees all the lines, and then Jesus ignores them and loves you anyway.